Good evening. Hope you're all well. Today we are learning Maseches Bava Daf Tzadi Daled, and we're starting about 8 lines or so from the bottom of Tzadi Gimel Amud Beis, and we're going to be getting into a deeper conversation now about the halachos of kinyanim as it relates to a gazlan. So typically, if I steal something and the item remains as is, I just return the item to you. That's Mufurash Pasuk and Chumash. Yesterday, as we began the parak of Hagoza, which speaks about these things, if I steal something and then I make a change of significance, if that change of significance is significant enough, then the change I made to your item makes it mine. And then instead of me having to return the item itself, the item that I've modified, instead, I have to pay you the financial equivalent. So here we're going to be discussing this idea in more length. Amar Abaye, 8 lines from the bottom of Tzadi Gimel Amud Beis, Reb Shimon ben Yehuda, Ubeis Shammai, Reb Elazar ben Yaakov, Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Reb Yishmael, all of these people, kulhu svira lehu shinui b'makom omed, that the change is just a change and it's not significant. And what that means is that if I do steal something from you, then even if I make a modification, it seems to be, and we'll have to see exactly how this stems with our Mishnah, it seems to be that the change is insignificant, and therefore, if I'm the Gazlan, I don't get to keep that item. I still have to return the item, seemingly even with its modifications. Now let's figure out what each of these shitas speak about. 5 lines from the bottom, Reb Shimon ben Yehuda Hada Amran. We learned his shita yesterday, and he is of the opinion that shinui b'makoma omed, that the change is deemed insignificant. Beis Shammai, where do we see that Beis Shammai is of the opinion that if a Gazlan makes a change, that his change is insignificant as it relates to his ownership? Maihi Titania. We have a brisa. Nasan lo chitin be'es nana va'asasan solas. Let's say that a man was with a zona, and as a form of payment, he gave chitin, he gave wheat. She, in turn, accepted the wheat and then processed it into flour. So if she made that change, is that considered enough of a change that that which he gave her can then be used for the mizbeach? We typically assume that if a man, for example, were to give a woman an animal as payment for znos, that animal is not shaykh for the mizbeach. But let's say here she got wheat and she changed it. Is that enough of a change? Or zeisim v'asa asan shemen. Or if a man gave the woman olives and she made it into olive oil. Anavim, if a man gave her grapes, v'asa asan yain, and she then in turn turned it into wine. Are these changes sufficient to make it that they can then be used in the Beis HaMikdash? Again, we know that the actual gift itself cannot be used in the Mizbeach. However, is this change, is this evolution of that original item sufficient in order to assume that it can then be used in the Mizbeach? So we see 2 lines from the bottom of the page, Tini Chada Aser, V'tanya Idach Mutter. It's a machlokas Tanoim. And the Gemara says, V'amar Rav Yosef, Tani Gurion, turning to the top of Tzadi Daled Amud Aleph, Demei Asporak. Rashi says that's a Shem Makom. He was from this place. His name was Gurion. He says, Beis Shammai is Osrin. Beis Shammai says that the item that I gave her, that she then changed to another form, remains usher in the Beis HaMikdash. What does that tell you? That the shinui was not sufficient. There is no such thing as a significant shinui. Even if he gave her wheat and she in turn turned it into flour, afal pi that it's unrecognizable because what she originally received was stalks of wheat and now all she has is flour. Lamaisa, says Beis Shammai, that is still considered usher to be brought in the mizbech because the shinui was an insufficient shinui. Ubeis Hillel matir. And we're going to drill down into the lamdas of each shita. And the Gemara says on the top of Tzadi Daled Amud Aleph as follows: Mai ta'ameh de Beis Shammai. What's the reason of Beis Shammai why he says that this change is insufficient? That if a man gives the zona wheat and she turns it into flour, that even the flour can't be used in the mizbeach? Says the Gemara, because Amar Kra, Gam shenehem lerabo shinuyehem. He learns from a drasha that the word Gam teaches us that not only is the item itself going to be prohibited for the woman to use in the Beis HaMikdash because it was for znos, but even shinuyehem, even something that was modified, also cannot be used. Uveis Hillel, what does he say? Well, no problem. He has another part of the pasuk from which he learns. Amar Kra, Haim velo shinuyehem. Only the item that was given is restricted for use in the Beis HaMikdash, but not their evolutions, not their iterations. So if a man, according to Beis Hillel, were to give her chitin and she turned it into solas, So the chitin cannot be used. That's esnan zona. Masha'en came, the shinuyim are allowed to be used. Machlokas Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel is a mekel. Says the Gemara, Beis Shammai, what do you do with Beis Hillel's pasuk? Haksiv heim. So he says, don't worry. Beis Shammai has it all figured out. Ahumi boile heim v'lo vladosehen heim v'lo vladosehen. That Beis Shammai says that what we learn from the word haim is that, let's say a man gives a zona, a cow, a pregnant cow, and then the cow has a baby. So the calf that was born is mutter to be used in the mizbeach. That's excluded from the prohibition, and therefore, if she were to receive this pregnant cow, she can't use the mother cow. She cannot use the mother cow for anything in the mizbeach. But if there's a baby that's born, that derivation is considered a valid form of gift for the Beis Hamikdash. Beis Hillel, what does he say? Tarte shamas mina, heim v'lo shinuyehem, heim v'lo vladoseim. He actually learns two things from the word heim, and therefore we now understand our machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel very clearly. Says the Gemara, wait 1 second. There's one thing that we forgot to do. We cross-checked the Mari Makomos of Beis Hillel with Beis Shammai, but we didn't cross-check the Mari Makomos of Beis Shammai with Beis Hillel. And the Gemara says 7 lines down on Tzadi Daled Amad who Beis Hillel Nami Haksiv Gam. If you look at the second line, we saw that the reason why Beis Shammai said that the shinui of chitin to solus is not considered valid is because of the drush of gam. It says gam, and Beis Shammai said l'rabo shinuyehem. So what does Beis Hillel do with the word gam? The Gemara says gam leBeis Hillel kashya. We've actually seen this Gemara before, and lemaisa we do view the drush of the word gam for Beis Hillel as unclear. We don't know, at least not in the Gemara itself. The Rishonim, I'm sure, we'll spend time on this, but from the Gemara itself, it seems that that the way Beis Shammai learned this pasuk's a little unclear for us. We understood how he used the word haim, and that he learned two things from haim that we saw earlier, haim v'lo shinuyehem, and haim v'lo vladoseim, but we don't know what he does with the word gam or how he explains it. Nevertheless, as we started, there were a whole host of people who agreed that changes are insignificant. The first Mari Makom was really from yesterday, where we saw Reb Shimon ben Elazar, where we saw Reb Shimon ben Yehuda, and then we just learned Beis Shammai. Who's next on the list? Reb Elazar ben Yaakov. Where do we see that, according to Reb Elazar ben Yaakov, that a shinui is insignificant as it relates to a gazlan, and even if he makes changes, he has to give back the item as it stands? Says the Gemara, Maihi Titania. Reb Elazar ben Yaakov Omer, Haresh gazal sa shel chitin. If I take a sa of chitin, of wheat, I take a significant amount of wheat, tachna, I grind it down into flour, lasha, I add water and make it into dough, ve'afa, and I bake it, v'hifresh mimena chala, and I separate the hafrashas chala, as we know that when we separate the right amount of hafrashas chala, and just to interject, we're fairly familiar that today the threshold of when we make a bracha on hafrashas chala is the equivalent of 5 pounds of flour. So in such a case, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov in this brisa says, Keitzad mevarech, ein zeh mevarech ela menayitz. How can you make a bracha on this? Hare, you stole the sa'ah shel chitin to start with. And nevertheless, I stole X, but then I took that and I ground it up and I added water and I baked it and I was mafresh challah. Still, he says it's not appropriate to make a bracha. Ein zeh mevarech ela menayitz. To make this bracha, you're considered a blasphemer. Ve'al zeh ne'emar botzeh barech no'atz Hashem. No'itz Hashem. Let me read that pasuk properly. Uvotzea beirech ni'etz Hashem. Excuse me. That a person who makes this bracha, they're a ni'etz, they're a blasphemer. So we see from here that he holds that the changes were insignificant, because if the changes that were done to the chitin that I stole were real, then Pashat, I would be obligated to make a bracha on this challah, on the hafrashas challah, because I own it. Elamai, it must be that I don't own it. It must be that I still have to give back that item, even though it's in a modified form. I stole chitin. I'm giving this guy 8 challahs back as what I stole. Yes, that's the din. The din is that, and you should not be mafresh challah on it. They're not yours. And the next shita, a fifth of the way down, on Tzadi Daled Amad Aleph, Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Maihi. What's the Mari Makom of Reb Shimon ben Elazar? That he holds that a change in the item that a gazlan stole is insignificant. Titania, Klal ze Amar Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Kol shvach sheishpiach gazlan yado al ha'elyona. That any improvement that happened while I stole something, if it's in my property and I improve it, so then my hand, I have the upper hand. What does this mean? That I, as the gazlan, have the upper hand? So let's say I steal your car, but I upgrade it. I give it new hubcaps, I repaint it, I reupholster it, I put money into your car. I stole your $50,000 car. Now your car is worth $70,000. So says the Gemara that the Gazlan has the upper hand. Ratza notel shivcho. If he wants, if the Gazlan wants, I can give you back the $50,000 car. But because there's $20,000 of additions and improvements, you, the Bailim, have to give me $20,000 for my expenses. And Ratza, but I get to choose as the Gazlan. Ratza omer lo hareshel chalafanecha. Or if under a circumstance it's not so nice, you can just give it back as is. So this is a little bit cryptic. My ka'amar, what does this mean? Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Sheshes hachi ka'amar. This is what Reb Shimon ben Elazar means to say in the Brisa. Ishpicha, if while the item that I stole improved in my property, notil shivcho, then I get to collect on the additions that I added to your item. Kichesh, but if in fact the value went down, I stole your car, I didn't take care of it, it started to rust, the wheels are falling apart, then Omer lo hareshal chalafanecha, because after all, the shinui b'makom ha'omed. So the reason why, if I take your car and I don't take care of it, I steal it, and now it's all rusty, I can just give it back to you. The reason why I can give it back to you is because the shinuyim that were made to the car are not shinuyim. Really, the shinui is b'makom ha'omed. The shinui leaves the original item as is. So asks the Gemara, if when I give you an item, I lower its quality and still I'm allowed to just give it back to you because shinui b'makom ha'omed ihachi, afilu ishbiach nami amre. Afilu ishbiach nami. It should also be the case that when I give back an item that's more expensive, I shouldn't have to pay for that because the changes that I made were a zero. If when I steal something and I lower its value, I'm not responsible to pay you for the reduction in cost of that item, then the fact that I repainted your car and changed the hubcaps and reupholstered the car, that's not your problem. That's my problem. I spent money on your car when I shouldn't have. So why is it that when the cost is lowered, when there's a depreciation, I don't have to pay you the depreciation, but when there's an appreciation, then you have to pay me for the appreciation? It's a stira. That doesn't make sense. Either we say the shinui matters or it doesn't. So to this, the Gemara says, Amre, no. The reason we make a distinction is that if I steal your car and I make a lot of improvements, I've invested money into your car. If we don't have a scenario whereby I can return the car to you and get paid back for the improvements that I put in, we're concerned that I won't ever give it back. And therefore, says the Gemara, Amre mibnei takonas hashavim, because we want it to be the case that people can do tshuva, we therefore built into the halachic framework that even though I, the Gazlan, stole your car and improved it by $20,000, even though really, technically, Medina, there's really nothing to say in regards to what I added. Really, the halachic change to your car shouldn't have ever happened, and therefore, really, Mida Oraisa, you have no obligation to pay me for the shvach, for the appreciation that I did to your car. Nevertheless, Mida Rabbanan, we do require you, the Bailim, to pay me, the Gazlan, for the appreciation that I added to your car, because otherwise, I might not do tshuva. Let's move on to the next shita. We're about a third of the way down on Sadi Daled Amud Aleph. The Gemara says, let's learn the shita Rabbi Shmuel and how we know that he is of the opinion that that a kinyan that changes that I make to an item that I stole are really irrelevant. He detanya mitzvahs peah lahafrish min hakama. Really, when I'm separating out peah for poor people, I should leave them growing in the ground. Don't even bother cutting them down. If I fail to do so, lo hifrish min hakama, then mafrish min haomrim. If I fail to do that, then I should allow the poor people to collect from the piles that I've made. Emor is actually one of the malachos d'oraisa, Shabbos Ayin Gimel. The Gemara there speaks about the 39 malachos, and one of them is Emor, where from the outside, it's you cut down the plant, and then you bring them into a pile together. You gather all the stalks of corn together. Now machines do that, and it's not even really gathered into a pile outside. It's really into a machine. But back in the day, they would gather everything in a pile. That's a malacha d'oraisa. So here, it's not Shabbos. So here, if I don't leave it for the poor people in the stalks, so then when I actually do put it into a pile on a Tuesday, then that's the appropriate time for the poor person to take. However, lo hifrish min ha'omrim, if I didn't give over to the poor people when the corn was sitting in a pile in the field, then mafrish min hakri, then after I move it from the ground into a basket, now I have a whole big basket of corn. So that's where you should take from. And That's only ad shalom mercho. That's only until the time that I, as the Baal HaKri, where I smooth out the Kri to make it all sit nicely in the container that it's in. Once I do that, mercho, once I do spread it out, so then you can't take from the Kri anymore, but rather me'aser, then I have to give meiser properly because the chiyuv of peah really changes here. And now because I haven't done my job properly, once I was memareach, now I first have to give meiser because there's a chiyuv meiser now on the peah. Normally peah is given it's pre-tax dollars. It lowers your, to speak in our parlance, it lowers your tax obligations because if I'm giving you a little bit of free while it's still attached to the ground, that's actually a good thing. And now I have to give meiser on that, on even on the peah. And then v'nosein lo, and then I have to give you the peah. And mishum Rabbi Shmuel amru af mafresh min ha'isa. No, you can even be mafresh once it's turned into dough. Let's say we're talking about wheat v'nosein lo. What do we see from here? That the changes that we've made are not relevant. If I steal from you, if I don't really, it's not really stealing. If I don't leave over your peah, even if I process your peah from growing stalks all the way to baked goods, Allah Alamaisa, Rabbi Shmuel says that we're mafresh even min ha'isa, we're even going to be mafresh from the dough. What does that show you? That shows you that the changes are really insignificant. And he is yet another shita that shows us this. So this is really what Abaye is doing over this first 3/4 of an amud, the last 8 lines of the previous page up to the halfway mark where we are, is that he's trying to tell us that shinui b'makomo omed, that these 5, 6 different shitas in the Tanoim and Amoraim all seem to hold that if I as the Gazlan steal something and I make changes to an item, the changes are not relevant and I have to give back the item as is. Very good. Amar le Rav Papa. Rav Papa halfway down says la Abaye, because Abaye was the one who just said the last 50 lines of Gemara, 40 lines of Gemara. So he says to Abaye, I'm not following. Ichpal kol hani tana, you've doubled and tripled and quadrupled, you've stacked up all of these different shitas, who all seem to hold that that there's no kinyan, and you did so tonight. You gathered all of them lashmin and kibei shamai. You gathered all of them to agree with Beis Shammai. Remember the brayth at the very top of the page, which is where today's conversation in earnest really started, because Beis Shammai said in regards to the case of the Esnan Zona, it was Beis Shammai who said that the changes that took place with the gift to the Zona, if a man gave a woman a Zona, gave her wheat and she turned it into flour, still usher to give the flour in the Beis Hamikdash, which means that the change of grinding it into the flour was irrelevant. And everybody's aligning. We don't even paskin like him. We paskin like Beis Shammai. I mean, we paskin like Beis Hillel. And Beis Hillel is of the opinion that that change is a significant change. And whereas Beis Shammai wouldn't allow the flour to be brought as a korban mincha, Beis Hillel would. So Abaye, what are you doing? Are you stacking the deck to try to find Mara Mekomos that agree with Beis Shammai? That's against our system. Why would you do that? Omar Le, Abaye retorts back to Rav Papa as follows. Hachi ka'amre. Really, he says to Rav Papa, here's what everybody's saying. Lo nechlaku Beis Shammai v'sil b'davar zeh. What Abaye is saying is that you have a misunderstanding of that brisa, the brisa that began on the bottom of Tzadi Gimel Amud Beis and wraps up to the top of Tzadi Daled Amud Aleph, our sugya about an Esnan Zona. You've misunderstood. There is no machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. Everyone agrees, like the brisa presented Beis Shammai, which is that if a man gives a zona chitin and she changes it into flour, the change is insignificant. And because the change is insignificant, so therefore we're in a scenario now where that flour equally cannot be given as an Esnan Zona. But the Gemara is pointing out that Abaye is pushing back on Rav Papa and saying it's not just Beis Shammai who holds that way, everybody does. Amar Rava. Rava now says to Abaye, okay, I see your list of Mara Makomos. You told me that Reb Shimon ben Yehuda, Beis Shammai, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Rabbi Shmuel, all these names, you all said that they indicated that we were talking about a case of shinui b'makomo omed, that if I steal something from you, that the change that's made is insignificant, and therefore, as a Gazlan, I just have to give it back to you as is. Says Rava, why would you say that? And Rava, in a very short and terse form, undermines all of the Mara Makomos that we just learned. Take a look at this. Amar Rava, Mimai, Dilma, perhaps in the one Mara Makom we didn't learn today, but yesterday. Ad kan lo ka'amar Reb Shimon ben Yehuda hastam el b'tzeva hol v'yochel aviru al yedei tzafon. Perhaps the only reason why we said that the color dye that we put in the wool, perhaps the only reason why that wouldn't work is because it was a color that was removable. And that's why, with the Shita Reb Shimon ben Yehuda that we learned yesterday, was a makel to say that the change was insignificant. But had it been a permanent tie, maybe he wouldn't say that. And Va'ad kan lo ka'amre Beis Shammai in regards to the Esnan Zona, Hasam Ela Gavoa, maybe only there because we're interacting with the Beis Hamikdash and Demais. That the image that's disgusting. You can't take something that's a chelik of an avera d'oraisa and use it on the mizbech. But by other things, perhaps it wouldn't be so bad to do that. The adkan perhaps lokamer Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov Hasam Ela le'inyan bracha. Over there, when we were talking about the case of Afrasha Schala, when Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov was of the opinion that you can't even make a bracha in zem avarech elamanites, perhaps that's only true le'inyan bracha mishum dehavle mitzvah abba be'avera, because you're trying to perform the mitzvah of chala well with something you've stolen. Maybe if I'm stealing and I'm using it without dealing with a mitzvah, perhaps the din would be different. And also, ve'adkan lo ka'amar Reb Shimon ben Elazar, 2/3 of the way down, a little bit more hasam, ela behakchasha dehadar. Perhaps by his case, we were only talking about a hakchasha, a reduction in the size of an animal. Dehadar, he became emaciated, but soon he'll come back to his own weight now that he's eating regularly. Adkan, and perhaps as well, but by Rabbi Shmuel, lo ka'amar Rabbi Shmuel hazam elo le'inyan peah mishum dechsiv ta'azov yasera. Perhaps by peah the din is different because we have the extra word of ta'azov, and therefore the din by peah should be different than everywhere else. So this is what Rava pushes back on Abai. You want to say that everybody actually holds that shinui b'makomo omed? No, maybe not. Maybe it's not shinui b'makomo omed. Maybe just in those there were unique quirks in the particular cases that you had that it appeared that it was shinui b'makomo omed. But really, it's not true. And really, maybe the shinuyim do taka cause a change in general, and therefore a gazlan who makes a change would not have to give back the original item. And v'chitema, if you want to say ligmor minei, you should learn from the word tazo, you should learn from peya to all the other areas that we just learned. Says the Gemara, you cannot learn from peya to other areas because there's a huge uniqueness in the world of peya. What's that? Says the Gemara, matno sanim, shiny. The matanos that go to poor people are different. They're not typical, and they are not to be viewed and expanded to other case scenarios. The Gemara continues. Kedeboy Rabbi Yonasan, this idea that we just shared that matnos aniyim are different is reflected by Rabbi Yonasan in the following. The boy Rabbi Yonasan, my time at Rabbi Shmuel. What is the reason of Rabbi Shmuel, who says what he says by peya? Is it mishum dekasavar shinui eno kone? Is it because Rabbi Shmuel was of the opinion that shinuyim don't make a difference? Odilma be'alma kasavar shinui kone. But v'hacha mishum dechsiv ta'azov yasera. But here things are perhaps different. So we can already see in Rabbi Yonasan's phraseology, we can see that Rabbi Shmuel perhaps is saying that the shinui is not the issue, but it's only because of the word ta'azov. And if in fact it were to be the case, Rabbi Shmuel were to hold that, if it were to be the case that he would hold that shinui is not kona, then what does he do? At ta'azov yisir d'kasav rachman alamali. Then what would he do with it? Elamai, it must be that Rabbi Shmuel learns it the way that we thought he did. Visu, and furthermore, l'rabbanon ta'azov yisir d'kasav rachman alamali. What would the rabbis also do with this? We'd have to figure out the machlokas over there in Peah. We'd have to figure out what the rabbanon would do. So the Gemara says, don't worry. We actually need the word ta'azov for the following brisa. This brisa is found earlier in this Masechta and in Nedarim and in Chulin and Tmura Nida. It's all over the place. Hamafkir karmo. Let's say that on Monday morning I am mafkir my entire vineyard, and then v'hishkim laboker. And the next day I woke up, ubitzro, and then I harvested everything. V'hishkim laboker ubitzro, and in the morning I harvested everything. The din is I'm chayiv in all of the various forms of tzedakah of the matnos anim. Chayiv beperet ubeololos ubeshekcho bepeah upater min hamaiser. And the Gemara says that I'm pater from meiser, and this comes from the word ta'azov. So that's how the Gemara would answer. So that's why Rava doesn't really like Abayi's approach. What do we do? Halacha l'maiser. Amar Reb Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, halacha Reb Shimon ben Elazar. He says that the halacha is like Reb Shimon ben Elazar. What does Reb Shimon ben Elazar hold? So that was one of the sugyas that we learned in the Gemara a little bit earlier. About a quarter of the way down, we were talking about the case of Kol Shvachshi Shbiach Gazlan Yado Al Ha'ezyona, that the Gazlan had the upper hand. So it says the Gemara, wait one second. 4 lines before the wide lines, 8 lines before the end of the page on Tzadi Daled Amud Aleph. The Gemara says, Amar Umi Amar Shmuel Hachi. Did Shmuel really say that the halacha is like Reb Shimon ben Elazar? After all, Amar Shmuel Ein Shaman Lo Legana Velo Legazlan. We don't measure, in this case, talking about the dead body of an animal, for a gazlan or for a ganav or a gazlan, ela l'nizakin. The only time we ever measure is in regards to cases where we're talking about nizakin, but not cases of death. Bishlam ala Rava, and now remember, we have a machlokas, Rava and Abaye. Rava said that it's lav dafka, that all of these cases we're talking about shinui, kone or not. And Abaye said they all were. So Bishlam ala Rava, the Amar, Kika Amar of Shimon ben Elazar Hasam be'akhasha de hadar. According to Rava, who reinterpreted Reb Shimon ben Elazar to say that if I steal your animal and it becomes emaciated in my care, there it's a hakasha, it is a reduction, it is a depreciation in the animal, but it's the other. We'll get him back to health. He'll become bigger again. So then lo kasha ki ka'amar halacha Reb Shimon ben Elazar the shinui makoma omed be'akasha dehadar. That in that case, when we saw that there was shinui makoma omed, when do we say that shinui is makoma omed? That's only by akasha dehadar, by a reduction, by a depreciation in an animal. It's going to go back to where it was. And b'chika amar Shmuel hasam ein shaman lo leganav lo nizakin. That was be'akasha delohadar. We're able to work out all the Mari Mekomos, is that according to this Shita, Reb Shimon ben Elazar, if a change is permanent, okay, so then that's one din. Then that one din is a real problem. It's a real shinui to the item. But if the change is not permanent, let's say the animal's emaciated, it lost 20 pounds, I could get it back to where it belongs, or I dyed something with a temporary dye, I could get that to where it was before, no problem at all. So that would be how Rava wriggles out of everything. Ella, 2 lines from the bottom, le Abaye, according to the Shita of Abaye, do Amar ki Amar Rashba, be'akhasha de lo hadar Amar, that in the case of Reb Shimon ben Elazar, we were talking about a permanent change. So then, ma'ika lememar, how would he explain things? Because after all, we now have a stira. We don't have a way to say that sometimes it's permanent, sometimes it's not. He explained the case as permanent, that the changes were permanent. So the Gemara says, Abaye masni hachi. Abaye actually learned the memra that we learned 6 lines ago a little bit differently. Meaning, 8 lines before the bottom of the page where it says, Amar Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, halacha Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Abaye learns that line differently. And on the last line, he says, Hachi Amar masni hachi, Amar Reb Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Got the name right, same people. And what does he say that Shmuel saying in the name of Rabbi Yehuda? Amru halacha Reb Shimon ben Elazar. There were those who said the halacha is like Reb Shimon ben Elazar. Vilei lo svirale. But according to him, according to Yehuda or Shmuel, he himself doesn't actually hold that way. And that is how we get out of this problem. The Gemara on Tzadi Daled Amud Beis, and we'll be going to the top of Tzadi Hey Amud Aleph, says as follows: Amar Reb Chia bar Abba, Amar Reb Yochanan, Davar Torah. We have a din d'oraisa. If you have something that is stolen, we always presume that it goes back to the way that it was, meaning it's always returned. That's the pasuk. And what's the drasha? Mikol makom. No matter what, if I steal your item, I update the hubcaps, I repaint your car, I reupholster your car, I have to give it back. Mikol makom. Tomar Mishnah Senu. What about our Mishnah? Our Mishnah indicates that it's seemingly not that way. Because if you look back at the beginning of the parak, it says, Hagozel eitzim ve'asa'an kalim, then Mishalim kshas agzela, you pay. Or the other case was son begodim. How does that fit with our Mishnah? So the Gemara says that our Mishnah, which says you have to pay back the value, but you, the Gazlan, get to keep the item, that's Mishum Takonos Hashavim. That's only because we want to enable people to have tshuva. And if I spent $20,000 investing in your car that I stole, it may be too high of a burden, too big of a challenge for me to return your car, and therefore I might not return it. Says the Gemara, Mi Amar Rav Yochanan Hachi. Did Rav Yochanan really say this idea that we just learned at the top of the page? The Amar Rav Yochanan Halacha Kistam Mishnah. We know in general that Rav Yochanan holds like an anonymous Mishnah. Vitnan lo hispik litno lo ad shetziva'u pater. And it says that if you didn't get to give the Reishi Sagez over to the Kohen before you dyed the wool, so then you're pater, which means that the change actually took place. What we just said at the top of the page, Veishu is like Zela Shurgazlam Mikol Makom in the name of Rav Yochanan. You can't say both things. You can't say that Mikol Makom, whatever the changes are, you have to give it back. And then at the same time, a Stam Mishnah, which Rav Yochanan also holds like, that if you dye it, then that's enough of a change that you can't give the Reishi Sagez. Amarlu, Ahumi Dirabanon. That really is only a rabbinic injunction. The Rav Yaakov That was the Rav Yaakov Shimei. Sorry, let me read that again. Amar lahu hahu midrabanan. One of the rabbis said, Rav Yaakov Shimei, and his name was Rav Yaakov. Ledidi mifar shali minei Rav Yochanan. I heard an answer about this exact question from Rav Yochanan. Kegon shegazal eitzim mishupin ve'asan kelen dehavalei shinui chozer lebriyaso. He gives the distinction that we mentioned previously, and that is that if it's a shinui hachozer lebriyaso, then that doesn't even count. And that was the previous case that we were discussing. That's when he says mikol makom. You always have to give it back. So again, think about Legos. It's chozer lebriyaso. Take all the pieces apart. You bought the package for $39.99, and now the package is worth $69.99 because you made it into a whole Gantz castle. Doesn't matter because it's chozer lebriyaso. You have to give it back mikol makom. If it were to have been a different case, if it were to have been the case of tzavo, then you'd be pater because that we presume within Rav Yochanan's understanding that it was permanent. So that was what the Gemara says. I stole wood that was sanded, meaning plywood. It's like fixed pieces of wood. The Brisa teaches us a quarter of the way down, kind of blending into a new sugya and a complex sugya as follows. If you have a thief, umalve ribis, people who lend with interest, sheikh ziru, and now they feel like they want to do tshuva, so they want to be machzir that which they stole. The Gemara says that when they try to give it back, ein mekablen mehen, you should not, says the Gemara, you should not receive what they're trying to give back. Yes, they stole from you, and yes, they're malve ribis, and they're trying, when they try to give back, then no, you're not supposed to do that. If I'm trying to give back the ribis I stole, you're not makabel. And not only that, but hamakabel mehen ein ruach hachamim nocha himenu. When the person is trying to do tshuva, and I try to facilitate that by taking back what they stole from me, the Chachamim are not happy with you. This is actually a machlokas, what these words mean. It typically means the way I just translated it, that the Chachamim are not happy with you. Rashi here has a little bit of a cryptic comment. Take a look at Rashi 10 lines down. Dibur hamaschil ein ruach chachamim nocha himenu. Rashi says, ein ruach chachamim nocha himenu, ein ruach chachma v'chasidus bekirba. I don't know. It's definitely different. It's not a question of the Chachamim not being happy with you. It seems to be a direct criticism of you. And the Gilyon Hashas over here picks up on this. I didn't look this up, but there is a Tosfos Yom Tov in Maseches Avos that speaks about the difference between the typical understanding of Ein Ruach Chachamim Noche Himenu and what Rashi says. Amar Rav Yochanan, Bimei Rebbe Nishnes Mishnazu. This Mishnah that we just learned, the Brisa about the Gazlanim and the Malvei Ribbis, was taught in the times of Rebbe. How do we know? The Tanya, 1/3 of the way down. There was a man, he was a petty thief. His whole house was filled with stuff that he stole from neighbors. And he wanted to do tshuva. Amar le Ishto, his wife said to him, Reka, you empty one, you've been a thief your whole life. If you decide to do tshuva, afilu avneit eno shelcha, your belt that's holding up your pants is not yours either. You're going to return everything that you stole. And in the end, he ended up not doing tshuva. Be'osasha, at that time, Amru, the Chachamim taught us, Hagazlana mumalve ribios, if you have a thief or someone who lends with ribis, sheikh ziru, who tried to return that which they stole, you should not receive it from them. That's because otherwise, if you would receive it from them, they won't do tshuva. Similar as before. Says the Gemara, wait 1 second. I'm not sure I totally understand this din. Let me just summarize. There's a little bit of subtlety here, and that is as follows. If I'm a thief, and even the belt that I'm wearing has been stolen, so if I've stolen a lot and I want to do tshuva, if I have to give back everything, I'll have nothing. So the Chachamim instituted that you, the victim from whom I stole, when I try to return it, you should say, just keep it. That's what we're talking about over here. You should not be makabel. And if you are makabel, then we have this, again, this cryptic line of Ein Ruach Chachamim Noche Himenu. That's what we're talking about. And the Gemara says halfway down with the Brisa, Meisvei. This Brisa we will see again in Maseches Bava Metzia. Hiniach lehem avim ma'os shel ribis. Let's say that a child is left as an inheritance money, but the money was actually collected be'isr. The father lent out 1,000 and he charged ribis. He got paid back 1,500, and the child got a $1,500 Yerusha with full knowledge that the $500 of the $1,500 that he has that really don't belong to him, they were really collected b'ribis. Afal pi shehein yodin shehein ribis, even though the child knows that of the $1,500, 500 of it is ribis, ein chayavan lahachzir. He has no obligation to return it. And the Gemara makes a diuk from this brisa. Inhu, the children, the yorshim who, delo, they're the ones who don't have an obligation to return. But ha'avihem, but the father, chayav lahachzir. So that's a stira. You just said above that we shouldn't be taking anything from people when they try to return it. Over here, it seems that the father has a chiyuv to return it. Which one is it? Says the Gemara, "B'dinhu de'avim nami eino chayav lahachzir." Really, it should also be the case that the father also has no obligation to return it. So why then does it say in the brisa that the children should not do the returning? Because of the extension of that brisa in Bava Metzia. So there, the Brisa speaks about items by which the father was identified. We don't have a culture like this where everybody knows what cow you have, but there are some dogs in our community where when you see them, you're like, oh, that's this person's dog that you recognize. Or if it's a car, oh, okay, that's this person's car. There's just some items that it's very clear who they belong to. They're iconic. They're descriptive of the person. Those things have to be returned. So says the Gemara, Tana Reisha, Nami Biditu, because in the Seifa, those items which have a unique din that they have to be returned because everybody knows that they belong to the father. So therefore, in the Reisha, it also made a reference of Biditu, but really there's no difference. Just like the son has no obligation to give back the $500 in ribis, so to the father also doesn't have an obligation to give it back. It says the Gemara, Mibnei Kvod Avi and Chayav Lahachzir. How can you say that it's because of the covenant of the father that you're obligated to return these items by which he can be identified? After all, Ikri Kan v'nasiva amcha lo saor. The princes among your nation you should not bring light to. Namely, your father didn't do something yashar. Your father stole. So why do I have to return his kavod when he did something wrong? That's not what the mitzvah of kibbud av va'em should be. And the Gemara says, what's the drush of v'nasiva amcha lo saor? Be'osem ma'aseh amcha. When the father does the right thing, he deserves kavod. But if he steals, that's not right. If he steals something and everybody knows that it belongs to somebody else, that's not the right thing. So the Gemara says, Kedamar Pinchas b'sha'at tshuva. Elsewhere he says this, and therefore hachanami over here to b'sha'at tshuva. Says the Gemara, that's why we have to do this, because the father did tshuva, so he now deserves kavod again, and we do apply the din of anasi v'amcha lo saor because he was a good guy now. Says the Gemara, if in fact he did tshuva, my boy gabe. Why does the father still have the item if he did tshuva? What about the pasuk of Heshives like Zela Shur Gadal? Says the Gemara, he did have to give it back, but he just didn't have the opportunity to do so before he died. Tashma, Hagazlanim umalve ribis, people who are thieves and people who lend with interest, afal pisha gavu, even though they collected, odd word, machzirin, they should be returning them. Ask the Gemara, Gazlanim, what do you mean, my shagavu? My gavu ika? What collection are they making? I gazel. If they stole it, then they're thieves. And lo gazel. So what do you mean that they're collecting things? The Gemara says 8-9 lines from the bottom of the page. Ela ema hagazlanim. When we talk about thieves, we're talking about malve ribis, and afal pi that the malve ribis, when they were collecting the money that they lent out, and the money that they brought back in as they were collecting was 50% more. So afal pi shegavu machzirin. So says the Gemara, that's what we're talking about over here, that money should be returned. Amrei machzirin ve'ein mekablen mehem, ela lama machzirin. It's very odd. We have a broken system. If what you're saying is that we shouldn't receive from them, why do they have to return it? What is just a charade? You're going to come over to me and say, Phil, I stole your car. Here it is, and I'm just going to say no. Skip it. It's a plus and a minus. It equals the net zero. So why are we making the guy do tshuva? So the Gemara says, because let's say siyat yidei shamayim, he does need to make the effort in order for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to actually accept his tshuva. You can't just sit there and keep the item. You have to make an attempt at returning it. Tashma at the bottom of the page, 6 lines from the bottom, Haroin v'hagaboyim v'hamuchasin tshuvasin kasha u'machzir l'makirin. If you have a shepherd, you have a gabbai tzedakah, you have a tax collector, their tshuva is very difficult. Tshuvasin kasha u'machzir l'makirin. And they have to give it back to those to whom they recognize that they stole from. Amre, but it says machzirin, that they have to return it. Ve'ein makablen mehem. Oh, ve'elalama machzirin, let's say sidei shamayim, like we said. Why are you saying these people have to do tshuva if lemaisa, the recipients, the original owners, are not going to accept it? What's the point? And we again say that it's only to be yotzei yidei shamayim, so that a Kadosh Baruch Hu sees that you've made an effort to do tshuva. Yehachi asks the Gemara, "Amai tshuvasan kasha?" What's so difficult about doing tshuva? Go over and say, here's your item. They say, no, it's a little embarrassing, but it's not enough to say that it's tshuvas and kasha. And furthermore, says the Gemara, Ema Seifa, the Brisa says, V'she'en makir and yasa ben tzorchei tzibor. You have to do community service. What's so difficult about that? And V'amar Rav Chizda, what you need to do is boro shichin umaros. The type of work that you need to do is dig pits and aqueducts to make the city a little bit better in regards to water dispersion. You're absolutely right. Perhaps this brisa, one brisa was talking about before the takana, and one brisa was talking about after the takana. Says the Gemara, 2 lines from the bottom. He says that perhaps when there is no item that's left anymore, which was how he understood this sugya, according to him, if he says that the item is no longer in existence, then maybe we don't have to say one is before the takana and one is after the takana sashavim. Really, idi la'achar takana v'lo kasha. Kan b'gzela kayemes, kan b'shein gzela kayemes. Now the cases are different. If I have the item in my possession, I should return it. If I don't have the item in my possession, then I should not return it. Wait 1 second. What about the story we learned just a couple of minutes ago? Avnate, the story of the woman who said back to her thief of a husband, but your avnate, your belt, gzela kayemesi. What are you going to do? You're going to return everything? So says the Gemara, my avnate, it wasn't actually the belt. It was the Dmei avnate. He had sold it on eBay. He had the cash in hand. That's what she was talking about. Says the Gemara, what do you mean? Every time the gzela is involved, the rabbis never said anything about it, meaning you always had to return the item as it was, as long as it was existence. We know that that's not true, and we've seen this numerous times in Shas already. If somebody steals a beam, the gzela kayemesi, the beam is in my house. I know exactly where it is. It's holding up my second floor. It's not that if I steal a beam and I put it into my house, then we have to pay with money. So why would you say that in general, if you have the item, it's different than if you don't? It's not true by the Marish. Says the Gemara, Shani Hasam. That case was different. The reason why the Marish was different was because the Kevanika Pseda de Bira, because if I were to take down that beam, I'd have to take apart my whole house. The beam was $20,000. The house is $500,000. And I lose all of my construction, the carpet, everything. I have to start over. So therefore, Shavua Rabbanan Kidolesa. The rabbis treated it as though it was that way. So therefore, according to this final approach, it seems to be that there's a difference between an item in general, an item existing and not existing, and that even when it does exist, if the returning of the item that does exist is extremely destructive, we will assume it is as though it wasn't. We'll stop right here, 5 lines down on Tzadi Hey Amar Aleph, and we'll pick up in Mir Hashem tomorrow night in person. Wishing you all a beautiful day.